Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place you meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to come and have a conversation with me, the easiest way is to reach out to me on all the different social media that I'm on. And you can find those at isaacl.dev. So with that, I'm looking forward to this one. We were having a great talk about all sorts of random stuff, and I just know this conversation is going to be great. So let's just get to it. So today, my guest is Ralph Squillace. Ralph, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ralph Squillace. I am a principal program manager. Oh, no, we don't say program anymore. Principal product manager at Microsoft. Given the reorgs that we have periodically throughout my career, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be a program manager once again. I'm in the Azure Core upstream team. Azure Core is the team that does infrastructure computing, raw compute, or core compute, as they say, containers, VMs, other types of compute, because I'm in the WebAssembly quite a bit. And upstream team is a part of the Azure Core team that does most of the interfacing with the open source crowd. That is, we build all the bits for Kubernetes, for AKS and Azure. We fix bugs and move them into the SIGs and author KEPs and HEPs for Helm and PEPs for something else, and all that kind of stuff. And so we're the kind of connective tissue for the open source cloud native ecosystem and Azure services in the compute space and across platform.
I mean, so the long and short of it is like, I mean, I've had Jeff Wilcox on my show. Jeff is another awesome open source. I know Jeff real well. Yep, awesome open source person at Microsoft. So you're one of like the open source people at Microsoft. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But I love to hear how it got started. Like my big thing is like origin stories, because I think all of us have like that visceral feeling of like we remember like when computing introduced itself to us. So do you have a story that you remember about like when the first time technology kind of introduced itself to you?
That would be the first time. Well, my origin story really was the first time I got a big paycheck. But it started a long time before that. No, I'm a little bit strange because, first of all, I'm a little older. And so I come from a generation, like when I was in the 70s, I was like 10, 11, and 12 in the late 70s. And you used to be able to order in that period of time from catalogs. You could order an assemble it yourself computer.
Sure.
Heathkit is the famous, kind of one, but that Bill Gates did that, and other people did that, and so forth. Jobs and Wozniak and so forth. And my dad worked I'm born and raised in Seattle, even though I'm not there anymore. And my dad worked for Boeing Computer Services, which was their internal IT system. And he would order all the PCs because they were working on mainframes at the time, completely, of course. And he believed that eventually PCs were going to be the future, that we would all have computing mechanisms. At the time, there were no such things hardly. And so he got them to buy all these catalogs for these mini, computers. And he would bring them home, and he would, of course, be exhausted. So he'd say, "Ralph, come here." And he'd give me this box with instructions, and he'd say, "Okay, make it work." And he'd go and have my mom make some spaghetti. Meanwhile, I would be like, "Okay, great," kind of thing. And to me, it was just Legos. Like you read a manual, it would tell you what you had to do, and you would then, it would tell you why you got to plug this in here, and this is where all kinds of things. And so, and then you would load, the operating system from, you had to type it in from something, or you had to, it would, later they came with cassette tapes or 8-tracks, and that would be the operating system and the memory, and you would plug in a cassette deck to the computer and load the operating system from the cassette deck and things like this, even before there were floppies. And so basically, I would build those. And then I'd go run into my dad and I'd say, "Here," and he'd say, "Okay, write a program." And of course, there was a manual for that. And so I'd do that. And then it would be like 9 p.m. I hadn't eaten, but I'd solved this cool problem. I built this Lego set, and you could plug in this Lego set and it would do something, right? Well, I would fall asleep. My dad would take it to work and he'd tell everybody at work, "Well, look what I built last night." I found this out later and got pissed off at him, but he was dead by then, and I couldn't get mad, which really kind of is really a cosmic joke. But what that meant was that I actually knew how computers worked long before I ever got into school. I did take programming in high school. I can't remember what it was. It was some sort of VMS-related system. In college, at undergrad, I took Modula 2, which was a Pascal-style language from Nicholas Wirth. And I did that because I already understood how programming worked. And so choosing the language is a matter of kind of changing your mind a little bit around the syntax or the grammar and still applying logic, right? Because programming is mental projection of logic.
Yeah.
And so although I did do that, I didn't really ever do a CS degree. My degree in graduate school, undergraduate and graduate, was history. I was a historian, trained as an historian. And I went and chased a charming and talented woman who became my first wife and the daughter of my mother, the mother of my daughter, the reverse. And went off to Turkey. And when I was in Turkey, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to finish my dissertation. And then I got bored with the dissertation, didn't want to finish it. And so I ended up repairing laptops for the first version of laptops that were out at that time, pretty clunky things, for all the consular officials, first consuls, second consuls, you know, adjutants, ministers, and various things at all the embassies around Ankara in Turkey. And that's how I made a living for a short while. And then I became a journalist in Turkey and covered, that was in the early 90s and so forth. And then I didn't know what I was going to do because I didn't want to be a professor. And so the whole doctoral part, I'd gotten 4 chapters out of into my dissertation. And it just like, I was writing about something that wasn't interesting to people. And so that gets demoralized. It's one of those classic dissertation failure. Well, short story is basically from there, I was from Seattle. So all my friends were being hired. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. And basically Microsoft was just sucking the living oxygen out of Seattle. They would hire anybody who could walk and chew gum at the same time because they had a university that they could train you.
Yeah.
Because they had to. And so I basically got hired at Microsoft because I had an interview where they were like, hey, what does this code do? And I said, well, it does this. And they go, okay, great. When can you start? And it was a very different market, shall we say, at that time. And I started work. I took a year, did a contract at Encarta in 93, 94. And I jumped from there directly into Ole 32, which was a part of the Windows platform at that time. And that was object linking and embedding, which became COM. And I stayed with that team as it became DCOM, and stayed with that team as it became COM+, then Project 42, which included J++. So I went through that fun history. And from J++ and the lawsuits, we went to .NET. And so I was part of the .NET team. I worked with Scott Guthrie. He was my PM for, I did a whole bunch of the SDK samples for the .NET 1.0 and wrote a whole bunch of documentation, advanced documentation for remoting and threading and things like this. And just kept going. I worked for .NET for a while, ended up working on a project called Oslo, which was a huge boondoggle where Microsoft had some good ideas and the market didn't want them, more or less. That's my interpretation. So for 4 years, I wrote software and documentation, programming documentation, and none of it ever reached the light of day. And bits and pieces of that got reused, but I ended up at Windows Communication Foundation. So that was the SOAP years.
Yep.
So software, well, hell, I don't even remember what service-oriented architecture SOIA meant. And WS Star, some wonderful times during that period, but we learned a lot of lessons from DCOM into WS Star. And the irony is that the work we do now in Cloud Native fundamentally, and in particular WebAssembly components, fundamentally an evolution over that Java, COM, Corba period with all the right lessons learned, which is an amazing trip. There you go. There's my getting started story.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that I find fascinating, and this is something that resonates with me, is like, I didn't know until I got my first paycheck, really, that there was money in tech, right? I knew that there were, I knew that it was so I'm a little bit younger than you. So like I grew up in like the Web 2.0 era, so like building websites and like MySpace pages and like front end work was like, but like I never realized that like there was a ton of money, even though I grew up during the .com. I guess I was insulated from the idea of like that. And then I remember I got my first the first offer for my job, and I was like, oh, that's a lot of money. And then I got my first paycheck, and I was like, oh, that's a lot of money. So
I'll even tell you something. There was this one time, so I was working on I got a job. So when I quit my PhD, right, all but dissertation, when you quit a PhD in history, what the hell are you going to be?
Yeah.
1994, shall we say. Okay. What the hell are you going to do for that? You're going to be a history teacher at high school, right? Or a junior college or something like that. I had a master's, but the answer was that a friend, like I said, had worked for Microsoft, and somebody had a connection in Encarta, and they needed history editors. And so I got hired under a contract in 1993, 94, somewhere in there. I can't remember because I'm so old. And they paid me $32,000 that year. And that year, a starting salary in Seattle School District, or I was born and raised in Edmonds, North Seattle. So that year, your starting salary is about 18 grand, 19 grand.
Yeah.
And so the 32 to work on this cool CD-based encyclopedia was a massive paycheck. Well, this is the funny thing. The next year I jumped to Olay, and they paid me I went from 32 in one day to a standard wage of $72,000. And in 1995, that was a huge amount of money. And to more than double your wages, which were again a double over a school teacher. My mom was a high school teacher, and so I knew very well. Well, you imagine that was just like, okay, that's it. I'm here. That's my career. That differential in those periods was massive, and so it's very interesting to take a look at the differentials now. They were far larger then than they are now, even though software pays very well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. Like I've always joked, it's like, people in tech, they make so much money that they become very jaded about how much every other like industry makes. Like obviously banking makes a ton of money too, but like it's always pretty interesting. And I look back, like my first job, and I was like, how was I able to live on that much money? Like that's not enough, right? Obviously priorities have changed now and whatever. I have a random question for you. What was your area of focus in history?
When I did my dissertation in, my general focus was post-Civil War U.S. Political culture, right? Specifically, the evolution of nationalism into the Cold War. And my dissertation, which never appeared, I focused on the morale operations branch of the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And I was looking at them as a intellectual. They had to create a social democratic theory around how mass communication actually worked in a society. Most of those people became the sociologists in Harvard and Chicago and Princeton and so forth after the war. They're the ones that created the kind of generic, what we might call Cold War mass communication theory. And so it was very interesting to me how they thought about that when they were looking at Nazi Germany, because they had to have a way of reconstructing these societies. They had to have a theory of how they fell into disarray, right? And communication, mass communication is a huge part of that. Propaganda, various other things. And then they had to have a way of, okay, if we win the war, how the hell are we going to rebuild these societies such that you have democratic radio or democratic newspapers or whatever it might be, Like, what is democratic in that environment? So that's what I worked on.
So I'm going to ask you this question, and I'm just generally curious as somebody who appreciates history as well, not to the level of you, but it's like, so what, like, I think about history a lot, especially as it pertains to tech, right? And how tech is very, it's very very easy to point out that like tech was very cyclical. Like I always use the example, it's like, just think about like your personal computing. Like they're used or in office computing. Like you always be like, okay, give people like super high performing machines. Okay, now we're gonna go back to like everything is cloud based and they have like small little, basically thin clients or little devices. And there's like a cyclical process to that. So I'm curious, as like as somebody who appreciates history, what are your takes on like the history of tech, say in the last like 30 years? Because that's been there's been a fair amount there, right? We talked about the Web 2.0, talked about this kind of transgression into, this idea of distributed systems and event-based architecture, and cloud native is the kind of like the cliche phrase. And now we're going into this world where everything is like AI and now agentic AI. I'm curious, is like, what's your take as a somebody that appreciates history in other areas of the world?
My take. Well, I'm looking for something that can be called spicy, because spicy is important. Got to have a spicy take.
Yeah.
Obviously your question is very wide open. So there's a couple of ways you can look at the history of technology, and one is just as a business, as part of capitalism and society. So there's nothing unusual, in my view, about the development of software companies and software as businesses in capitalism, right? Like they take money. Sometimes you trade money for time. Like you can just burn yourself up as a startup, with one or two people and not make any money for a couple of years. If you can live in mom's garage, for example, to take the classic sort of example from the 70s and 80s. But otherwise, the real problem is that you get successful there, and there are tons of famous ones. What happens is you get enough power and you get enough money that you can invest in larger, more complex systems, and those complex systems have to bring things together. And networking is a critical part of that. Otherwise, you've just got a bunch of computers that are maybe fantastic, but they stand alone. So without fundamentally shared networking, you have a bunch of mainframes forever. And the mainframes get better, but essentially the mainframes become so large that you can have some systemic problems with respect to the complex networking, right? But the interesting thing is, what is proven true year after year is that if you component the complexity and break it down, you can actually replace it with other forms of something that does that. That's much simpler. And that process is recurred. So you've got centralization, like a giant mainframe, and you've got a decentralization, like in PC period, right? But once the PCs become powerful, if you can network them, you start gaining in this kind of network computer, which we now call cloud native, but at that time they're just network PCs like LANs, and then we had WANs and stuff like this. And once they can all talk to each other, then you have and I'm going to use a phrase that nobody uses today, but just it'll make you smile because it is kind of one of the phrase. You end up having agentic PCs. That is, you have little MPC servers behind which is somebody's PC. And essentially you can write a program that talks to all these little PCs, and pretty soon you have a cloud native data center, even if it's just between you and the desk next to you in the office, for example. And we're talking about the 80s, early 90s, something like this. Those things become bigger. And so that network becomes what, the internet jumps onto that. It turns out that these simple protocols of the internet work really, really well. HTTP, and actually in its form of headers and body and content types, turns out to be much better than Soya and WS Star, but there were a ton of money in it, and it failed because it was better to be simpler and have a common protocol to pass around little JSON packets or XML packets or whatever you wanted to have. And so we get into something that is literally a proto public cloud. and the only boundaries are something. So you have this weird flexion in the market that involves money and business. You got to be able to sell something.
Yep.
Because without selling something, you can't pay for it. And at the same time, during this whole period, well back into the 50s, people are sharing code, but we never called down open source people.
Sure.
Right? But like, you know, TCP IP stuff, right? The early network, that was all just, here's how to do it. Here's the format. Here's, you know, and you made an implementation or you shared the code, and pretty soon everybody had a TCP IP stack. Right? Like there aren't any, the whole infrastructure is open source. And without that, it couldn't work. And yet they all worked for big networking companies or universities or something like this. And, or, you know, or my dad worked for Boeing, for God's sakes. And so the interesting thing is, all during that period where capitalism is building up these systems by sort of re-centralizing and decentralizing, decentralizing, the transistor becomes the chip gets smaller and smaller, more and more transistors, so you break those things up, and then you can have multiple chips, and those multiple chips become multiple cores on the same chip, and, you know, like those steps keep ratcheting, and they take more money all the time, but they make more money in their business. So it's capitalism is working for some definition of work.
Sure.
And everybody's sharing code. And at some point in the, I would call it 70s, 80s, that shared code, the one part of it that was problematic was the operating system, which was Unix. And so Unix had to be destroyed because capitalism wanted more value to be free. And the way to disrupt the mainframe world, to disrupt even, if you're going to have a PC market, you're going to have an operating system that can run PCs that is not Unix, because Unix is owned, right? It's intellectual property. So there is this moment where capitalism, mega capitalism at the time, got together to protect this young operating system hacker called Linus with a bunch of lawyers, and we get Linux out of that, right? And there's a bunch of details.
Sure.
But fundamentally, the point is that open source and sharing code and intellectual ideas in code has happened all the time. But it wasn't always called open source. And it was only after the creation of Linux that we got the kind of marketing juggernauts of mega capitalism talking about open source as this special cultural thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to just, hey, we're sharing ideas in code. Here's my idea in code, and, you know, like this kind of thing. And so that is funny to me, because now, or really when Microsoft started, for example, if I could talk to Microsoft, when Microsoft started doing Linux seriously, I was doing Linux at Microsoft. There was a underground Microsoft group that would run Linux in the late 90s, early 90s, mid 90s and late 90s. And during that period of time, Microsoft was a big company, and it's just had a TCP IP network. That was it. It was just a wide open LAN, and you could do anything at night you wanted to do. And so a whole bunch of people would run Linux and do all kinds of things, or map out networks or play games or whatever it might be. And I was one of those people. When Microsoft started doing Linux publicly after the "we hate Linux" period because it's going to lose us money, that period was really amazing, because people would say, you know, Linux is free, Linux is great, you know, we hate you, you know, because you tried to kill Linux, kind of thing. And the irony was that the infrastructure to protect Linus and his collaborators to create Linux was paid for by big business in order to destroy Unix. And so and in addition to that, the other influence that's really important is that the chips became standardized because they had to run Windows 95 or DOS in general. And that's also critical, because otherwise there wouldn't have been a center of gravity for devices for Linux hackers to make work as well. Devices would have been anything. You'd have, you know, think of it like Many people will not remember vinyl albums 33 RPM, but those who are geeks about vinyl and do that stuff now will realize that in the end there were three formats: 33, 45, and 78. But there were a ton of other formats that individual companies built, but we don't know about them right now. And most people, for example, your age or a little younger, will probably only know about 45s and 33s. And if they know about 78s, it's because some grandfather mentioned that they used to be 78s as well. Those kind of formats, the same thing that happened. There's nothing different about that evolutional procedure. And now we have abstractions for all these things. And so we can call it cloud native, but fundamentally it's just a series of abstractions layering on the same process as before. And one of the fascinating things is the massive centralization that public clouds brought to the market was fantastic for certain customers. But for other customers, it's very destructive. If you want to keep your data with you, if you want to keep your data in a certain place, if you want to, not have anybody have access to your data, for example. Yeah. And so there is now very much a strong pushback, I think is the word is, called local first programming kind of thing, if you've heard of that. Mm-hmm. That is very much sort of go back to the client application, but make it connectable. Yep. If you want, kind of thing. So, I don't know if that really is a discussion that interests you, or whether my points are bland and anodyne.
No. It's so a couple of things you said that kind of trigger like thoughts in my head, like, because now we have this like open source today is kind of ubiquitous with free, right? Like, unfortunately, to the effect that people think open source, they think of, some repo that's on GitHub that people can download. Yes, there's probably some licensing to it, but I want something that I can use right now without having to pay somebody.
Sure.
And I've had plenty of conversations about this sort of topic on my show, and I don't want to kind of belabor them, but like the idea that's like open source in free software, it's not free like free lunch. It's in this world where people are giving up their time to do something they're passionate about. And I'd like to kind of get your thoughts as somebody that's in this space. Like, for what it's worth, you work for a very large company that both uses and contributes to open source and builds open source.
Yeah.
So like, what is kind of your methodology as it pertains to when somebody says like, this maintainer is trying to all of a sudden make money for their work, we should just move to a maintainer that's not doing that?
Yeah. Well, there's two answers really. There's a business answer and what I would call a healthy business answer.
Sure.
Right. Like there of course are, you can grab some mega billionaire capitalist guy, over here, and they might just say, well, it's free, I can take it and use it for whatever, like I get that, right? But if you're going to talk about a healthy business sense, the perspective is, listen, the real world is built on your support of your dependencies.
Yes.
And this is true in software, but it's also true in any logistics chain. It's true if you're doing business, like if you're a department store. All of this is true. And even in families or in friendships, your dependency chain, when we're talking about friendships, a dependency chain seems like a horribly contorted metaphor, but in reality, your friendships are based on trust.
Sure.
They're based on your knowledge of the people, and you know that they'll give back to you and you give to them, right? And so from a business standpoint, you really have to think that what you're investing in, what the value is that you have, is the confidence and engagement investment you have in your dependency chain. And so if something is free in your dependency chain, you must engage and invest in that as well, because it's your dependency chain that provides your customers with the value that they want. There's an old guy phrase can I swear on this podcast at all?
Yeah.
Okay. There's an old guy phrase for software engineering, which is nobody wants to run your fucking software.
Sure.
And that is absolutely true at scale. Some people, developers, usually want to sit there and run it because they want to figure it out. But at scale, That's largely true, which means that the value is not in the software, it's in the running of the software for somebody else. And that is actually the important part of the business answer. In open source, you must invest in the business. So you must invest in your dependencies, which are open source dependencies. That means the humans have to be looked after. They have to have some compensation of some sort. In a big business case, much of that conversation is we hire them and help them contribute. For example, I used to be for several years, I was the PM for the Helm team, what was the largest group of the Helm maintainers. They were our employees. They were acquired when Microsoft acquired Deis several years back, 2016, I think it was, 2017, early 2017. Can't remember, somewhere in there. And that team they were just Microsoft employees, and our investment in Helm was to keep the ecosystem going and drive Helm forward. So our big advance there was we paid for the people to build Helm 3. And if you're an old CNCF person, you'll know that Helm 2 had Tiller in there, which was this kind of native component that could, be full of bugs. And it wasn't really, CRDs didn't exist then, so you had to build something that controlled the cluster. But by the time that, this period rolled around, there were CRDs, and you could actually bring Tiller in a native Kubernetes way and apply RBACs and things like this. Once that was done, we built Helm 3, and that was Microsoft bought and paid for.
Yeah.
Like there were other companies, absolutely, that contributed, no question. But the core of that work was a Microsoft check.
Sure.
And that was our investment in open source, and for a good reason. Everybody wanted to use it, not just Microsoft, it was for everybody in the world. But the truth was that Microsoft customers wanted to use it, and we wanted to make sure that they had that ability to use it and the confidence that if they found something wrong, we could go and fix it.
Yeah.
That's an investment in your dependency. That's your business answer. Now, here's the fun part.
Yeah, let's go. Spicy one.
Spicy one is that open source people, the individuals who lay down the code in the first place, have widely varying expectations of what is going to happen.
Yep.
And that's called freedom.
Yep.
And freedom, as everyone agrees, except for those who have nothing to lose, according to me and Bobby McGee, freedom can be painful and full of poverty. It can also be remunerating. You just don't know. It's based on your choices. And so if you give away your work, you do it because your heart is larger than other people. And that makes you a better person, in my opinion. Like when you give to others, that act is beautiful. It is one of the most important things that humans can do.
Yeah.
Here, please have this glass of water. I poured it for you. You may later sit there and go, you know what? I give you a lot of glasses of water, and you kept coming back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't you tip me or something? Because I got to buy a new pair of jeans. Now, I get it. At a human level, I get it. Okay. But you either believe in giving something away or you don't. That's freedom. And it was your choice all along. You don't have to give it away.
Yeah.
Now, if you change your mind, which is much the rage these days, or at least it's in the press. I mean, it probably happened a lot more, but we, no famous examples recently. Now, if you change your mind, I understand. You put in 90% of all the commits. I get it, right? If you gave it to the CNCF, or if those 10% of the commits were other people busting their butts, and they were part of your becoming successful, I can name 12 different projects here, but the point is, pick one. You're essentially forking other people's work. And while they also contributed of their own larger hearts to your stuff, you then took that piece of their heart and decided you were going to make money with it, but you're not paying them. You believe that you get your value, but they don't get theirs.
Sure.
My spicy take is, I believe that's unethical. Whether it's legal or not, it is unethical.
I mean, so I will say this.
That's my spicy take.
No. I mean, and it's completely founded, and it's not. It's if you lay it out, it's not a spicy take. But I think the big difference in what makes it, in my opinion, not a spicy take versus how people can interpret it as a spicy take is this. You're talking about equity between maintainers or contributors.
Yeah.
And I think the big, I guess, viralness of, say, open source project A decides to switch over some licensing where a commercial license where people have to pay if they make over whatever, right? Like that example that's happening a lot. The response that people have isn't, I want to make sure the maintainer gets their money or the maintainers get their money. It's how dare they take away my free lunch.
Yeah.
Right. And what I think you're saying is completely founded. It's like, let's say that, let's just take example, like open source project has thousands of stars. It's used by every big company on the planet. It's got a team of maintainers that's in like the 10s, the 15s, the 20s, right? But it's got one person who's kind of like the figurehead, who does primarily most of the commits, but they're not the person who's done all 100%. That person decides, is their kind of, it's in their repo, they're the org runner or whatever. Basically, you get my point. And they decide to monetize it in some capacity. And they're not sharing that discussion and sharing the eventual likely revenue with the other contributors. You're saying that's unethical, which I 100% agree with.
Yeah.
But
I'm saying I see that. My belief is it's unethical.
Yes.
But you said I can take the argument from there.
Yeah. And let me just finish my point.
Sure.
It's when you like the discourse ends up being around how greedy that person is for wanting to make money off of their work. That's correct. Right? That's the discourse.
Yep.
I don't disagree with either points. So if to push back on the unethical point, what if it was a collection of 15 to 20 people that do 99% of the commits?
Yep.
They decide to form a business, and then they they create a not closed source, like a different licensed version of their software that gets packaged for sale.
Did you use the word fork or not?
So that's interesting. So
because my take is, hey, it's open source. Fork it, choose a new name, move on.
Yeah, but then there's a lot of examples of very large companies taking forks, making them products.
Guess what? Sure. Okay. Again, this is a very good conversation because Adam, creator of Chef and stuff like that, has a very good argument that the branding there is the value, not the code. Remember, I told you code is free, or maybe I didn't say this, but quite so much. But we have so much free code that you got to realize that right now in the world we're in, all the code is free. It's actually valueless. It's not technically true, but at scale, it is not even a commodity. You can copy anything from anywhere. You go to the CNCF and look at the roadmap. It doesn't matter what you want, a top spinner, a database, a router, a web server. There are 10 or 20 that are fully open source. You can use them, and they all basically are great. They all basically have some problem that the other one doesn't have, blah, blah, blah. And you can make a choice and make an argument that, like, oh, they should be ranked in this quality level and so forth. But functionally speaking, there's no value in the code. There's value in hosting the solution, as we said. Nobody wants to run your goddamn code. Okay. Almost all the time, the problem with the way people have gone about it, Adam's argument, which I agree with, is that companies with money, mine is one, okay, have the ability to just fork and run away with other people's work.
Happens all the time.
Yes. Now, that is true. The vast majority of value in a monetary sense, in a business sense, is claimed by those companies that have the money to take advantage of it and run it, because it's running it that has the value, not the code. And we mistake at our peril, but Adam's point still valid. There are business reasons why we make this mistake, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a mistake to think that the value of our open source code is that somebody wants to run it because it's our code.
Yeah.
No, somebody wants to run it because the client says, please run that crap.
Sure.
And that's how they charge money. And so the interesting thing is that we have an interesting friction intellectually between the value that we attach to the code we wrote, because we wrote 99% of it, and the idea that somehow that is the value.
Mm-hmm.
It's real easy to make that mistake. There is some value there. What it actually is hard to know, because the truth is clients don't pay for that code. They pay for the service that you charge, and that comes with all the dependency support that I was talking about earlier that a business provides. So there's this weird conflation of the code itself, which you busted your butt to put in there, and the actual running of the code as a service and collecting money for it, which the customers actually don't really care about too much. I can talking about customers till the cows come home, who will tell you, and these are the best customers, I love these customers, they will tell you, I don't care what it's called, make it easy, and I don't want it to break.
Yeah.
You tell me what to do, I will have the developers do it. Now, they will say, I want it to be open source because I want it to be portable and go somewhere else and things like that. And that's, to a large degree, one of the features of Kubernetes code is that you have the ability to possibly port it. But in the real world, that's not actually what happens.
Yeah.
You're on a running and trusted distribution. And so you will not move that code, if at all possible, until you are forced by some external, crisis to move that code. Right? This is the fascinating thing, is that friction, that cognitive dissonance between the code I wrote and put my intelligence into and the thing people pay money. Those are different things.
Yep.
And they would not exist had the code not been open sourced in the first place, so that people could run it. So if you take whatever project you want, Valkey or Redis or whatever, thing, Redis would not be Redis without open source.
Oh, sure. That's not even a.
No, but that's a critical part of the spicy.
Sure.
The point here is the value they want is the name Redis. You can fork the code anytime.
I see what you're saying.
You can fork the code anytime. Yeah. And yes, Adam's right. The big businesses make the majority of money off of this because they can pay for forking the code and making it run. Right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't a cognitive dissonance between those two things. They're not separate, but they're too easily thought to be exactly the same thing, and they're not. That would be my spicy take.
I mean, look, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I think.
Thank God.
Well, I mean, even if I did agree vehemently, you'd be like, "Well, that's your opinion, man." But I love this conversation because there's so much nuance in it. And as somebody, like, we were talking a little bit before we got started about like being like I'm a very binary person. So like when things start to like fall into like the grayish nether region, I get like very uncomfortable, but it helps stimulate my brain. There's so much nuance in this discussion. And I think one of the things that I've never thought of, and I think you articulated very, very well, is that like it is not one person. Like not only is there not one person who's like, the dictator of open source project A. It's an ecosystem. And the second that things start to no longer adhere to like the contract that is signed when somebody creates an open source project, not like a social contract, right? There's a social contract when you create an open source project, and you continue to deliver on that social contract as you get more and more community people, like you get people in it. And once you start to think about making money off of it, you are in breach of that social contract. Is that a summarization of how you're phrasing it? Yeah. I'm not saying like social contract,
I would
like
say
Jean-Jacques Rousseau social contract, but like,
but actually Rousseau would argue you were, but,
sure,
my point is that actually, the word breach is a strong one. I would say that it's actually, accurate in my sense. The point here is that at that point, what you're doing is you're deciding your interests are valuable, right? Because you have a sense that maybe you could make money off of this and you're not making money off of this, whatever it might be, whether it's before it gets famous or after.
Sure.
But unless you're thinking of bringing along your minority participants, those people that didn't do the 90% of the contributions, you know what I mean?
Yep.
You're basically saying, okay, I've decided to hell with that prior contract of being open source and creating community and the whole thing. That contract is based on interpersonal human trust and respect. It has to be. If it isn't, I'm not sure how you're going to create a community. Then you're going to just do all the commits yourself.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's fine.
What if you start a project with, just by the way, I'm probably going to turn this into a money thing. So just be aware of that. Yeah. Yeah,
you could say that. And you could say, listen, right now it's Apache 2 or MIT or whatever, right? Right now it's Apache 2. If I decided I think I can do something with this, I might, fork it and make it, something else. Basically people will say, okay, as long as you tell me you fork it, I can fork it too, or I can keep it or whatever. Here's the trick though. In business, you have to brand something because people they need a name, a label for your magic thing, right? This is true in society too. We got labels for everything: him, her, they. My label is Ralph, for example. But the point here is that humans like labels; they work really well with them, and that's why advertising and business marketing uses them. So, are you wanting the code for your thing, or do you actually want the name? That also becomes an interesting conversation. If you're of the opinion that your hard work is in the code, then the name shouldn't matter at all, should it?
Nope, it shouldn't.
Shouldn't. But it does in 100.1% of the cases, which technically is impossible, but it's true. And so if you think the code doesn't matter, name matters, right? Okay, well, that's a different thing. But if you say to somebody, I'm going to keep the name and the code, very few people are ever going to contribute their hard-earned time, their X number of seconds in their lives. How many do they want to just effing give you and watch you walk away with them?
Yeah.
That really won't happen. So, for example, I'll give you a megacorp example of this. Microsoft, when we started running Linux VMs, and we purchased Deis for Linux expertise and so forth, and Helm maintainership came with that, and various other things, and a good portion of the Deis crew built Azure Kubernetes service, and a bunch of others did the Helm stuff. They're off doing WebAssembly stuff now, which I love, which is fantastic. And I get to keep collaborating with them upstream, even though they have their own company or work on other companies. And that experience where they came, where was I going with this? I think I lost my thread.
You were talking about Deis and
yeah, but I was giving you an example of Microsoft. It was an example of the name. God, it's 8:49 p.m. here, and I'm getting a little fuzzy, so forgive me.
Let's move on to something else, and maybe it'll come back to you.
Do it, and it'll probably come back.
All right. So we've talked a lot about this idea of trying to do what's right by the community and do right by the maintainers and right. And now we're in this world right now in the last 2 years where you have companies that they're not forking code and reusing it. They're just scraping the code to build context for LLM models.
Yeah,
And I would love
that's an interesting one.
I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because I think at least if you're doing the fork, you're admitting, I need this. I need this for whatever thing I'm doing. But if you're just blindly scraping publicly available information, the question becomes like, are you doing something that is unethical or ethical? And I don't want you to say like company A is unethical.
Yeah,
because that's not my point. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I get it. So first of all, this will be one of those areas where professionally, there's things I can comment on, things I can't comment on. Partly, in large part, because there are legal issues I just don't know about.
Sure.
Right. So, for example, GitHub is a division, a part of Microsoft, but I cannot speak to anything GitHub is doing or not doing because I actually am completely ignorant about that. Now, that said, what I can say is, listen, if you get your stuff away for free and put it on the web, you published it. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
The internet is the world's library,
sure.
For better or for worse. And so that means that basically all the text that we've been spewing for the last 30 years on some website or other, including our code, we gave away for free, is scrapable, in my view.
Sure. Okay.
And I actually think that benefits most people, because if it's public code, that's one thing, right? So let's just talk about the public code and the open source licenses, all that kind of stuff. Basically, code is structured thought, right? It's when we get back to the kind of everybody can do programming, it's structured logic, you're projecting. So if we can build programs that build giant token graphs out of the world's programming code that's in public realm, all we're doing is repurposing the stuff we've already given to the world. And in that sense, the idea that you should argue that a program shouldn't read it, but you can at any time not only read it, but use it to make money is a little bit, I'm like, I don't know where you're going to go with that, but it's completely unpersuasive to me as an individual, speaking as Ralph,
sure.
Not speaking for Microsoft. But if somebody is ingesting something, and I think somebody because I know that there are tons of newspaper reports about this or that organization, is ingesting stuff that is actually not publicly published, and for which the intellectual rights are owned, right? Then I'm sorry, but that wasn't published on the internet. It was not dropped on your doorstep like the newspapers from the newsboy, of my youth.
Sure.
Right. Well, actually, and even in that case, you paid for it. It's not like a billboard where you drive by it every day and you you see it. It's there. You've read it. It's in your brain. You can't argue that somehow but with private stuff, you've got a very solid argument. And the standard "I'm not a lawyer" applies, but as far as I can see, the early cases on that are that lawyers also think that's true.
Sure.
And I think that's true, he said in a high-pitched voice, as a Ralph.
Sure. I mean, I
don't. But that's not my major interest in AI, though. My major interest in AI is protecting the execution of those things. If they're built well, if they're a good model, right? I spent a whole bunch of my time working hard on trying to figure out how you execute AI and don't just leave that process wide open to the world's malicious code. Yeah. That's hard.
Yeah. I mean,
I do a lot of that.
I think and that wasn't my attempt to be like, look at bad company for taking all this public code. But I think that there is a thoughtful conversation to be had around like what is and what is not free use. I think you are very much in the camp that like it's if it's available via a browser.
If you published it, yes. Yeah. If you published it on the internet, it is available without authentication, without an account. and it's under A2 or MIT or some, similar, you get to use this as you see fit license, you've made it available to everything,
Sure.
including programs.
Yeah.
That's my take.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I think the if you wanted to get like tinfoil hat, I think that there's a lot of people out there that believe that, oh, there's some nefarious thing that's going on that's not just that. And we don't need to get into that.
I will say that in capitalism you can find nefarious things.
Oh, sure.
That exists.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think in general? Like, I just looked at the time and I want to kind of wrap up.
Yeah, sure.
I think we've talked a lot about open source, and I love that because I love, like, the name of the show is open source. So obviously talking with people about open source and open source being part of their job. I'd love to get your thoughts at, like, the open source, I guess you want to call it, history has been around for almost as long as technology has. Like we talked about that. You talked about it a bit earlier, right? And I think now, like, we've gotten to this point now. I mentioned, like, open source being ubiquitous with kind of tech. Like, there's not a lot of people out there that don't take advantage of open source, don't contribute to it. They go into a job, they write all of the code. They don't use IntelliSense, or they don't use like, there's not very many people out there that don't touch open source daily as a part of their job in tech. And that's becoming more and more prevalent with Copilots and Lovable and Cursor and all these sort of things, right? And as we look forward to the future, and I'm not in this camp, but there's a lot of people out there that are believing, like, the Java developer is getting too big. And it's getting so big to the effect that, okay, if a technology can come in and do all of that stuff substantially faster.
Oh, that's fascinating. I haven't heard the question phrased that way.
Well, that's why I interview people, man.
A good point. That's interesting. Okay, so two thoughts. One is that a lot of people forget, especially developers in the environment that we're in open source and so forth, containers, Kubernetes, but other open source environments as well, languages and things like this, seem to think that the last 10 years there's going to be open source developers forever that would join a community and continue contributing. I actually don't believe that's true. I think that the environment we're in now is so like, there was a massive zero interest rate period effect in which it was so easy to create a company, hire some people, pay them money for 2 or 3 years and burn that and get open source work done, that I think that over the next 5 years, and right now the world economy is not necessarily looking so cheery.
Sure.
As things like that constrict, as interest rates go up, as there's inflation and so forth, to the extent there will be, we're going to find that the environment of open source development constricts dramatically. And I think that there's going to be a certain subset of people who will start their company with very restricted semi-open licenses, or really lean into the lessons that have been learned in the last 5 and 7 years about reforking and yanking licenses and things like this. I think we're going to have a lot less. I don't think that you can just randomly pick a time in history and expect that there's a bunch of great, talented people walking around with big, huge hearts. I think those kinds of opportunity moments in society wax and wane. They get, there's more people available and fewer as the world economy changes. So let me, interesting hypothetical, right? If India, let me choose India and not China, right? If India decides to educate every single one of its young, population, and they all become programmers and start writing open source code, right? They will swamp the world with open source functionality.
Sure.
And, like, what will, to talk about a US market, what will United States developers do in that market when all the world's code is free, far more than they could ever produce?
Yeah.
Right? You're going to build a new DB? We have 27. You're going to build a new messaging system? We have 342. Like, what's going to happen there? And what that actually means is, if you have 342, your world of, like, let's say you are at a company or at a business and you want to decide which technology you choose. How the hell are you going to put these things together?
Yeah.
There's more code coming out every day than has ever come out in the history of humankind. And it's all free. Which one do you know? Which one do you choose? Which one? Do I do MCP? Do I do the A2A? Do I do the write my own endpoint? Because that's basically what MCP is. And like which one do I do? And then I've got front end. How does it appear in there? And that's JavaScript, which is not. And this and authentication systems and, all this stuff. It is not that it's chaotic. It's that it's almost exponentially chaotic now. It is extremely hard at any one point in time to make a technological choice that is stable for your business.
Sure.
That is a very hard thing to do. And we are not imagining the change. That sentiment that says it's chaotic, that says it's hard to choose, that says there's too much, right? That is actually correct. It is vastly different than it was 5 years ago and radically different than it was 10 years ago. And most people haven't, it's the classic frog boiling thing. It happens slowly.
Yeah. So what's your advice then to somebody that's getting into tech right now?
They can choose to learn.
Yeah.
So that's easy to say, but more or less, listen. Get some list of databases and learn one or two to kind of the 80% case.
Sure.
Right? Make sure you can use them. So, in fact, I wouldn't even do that. Do one relational, do one graph, or do one graph and do one document DB, right? Like, something like that. And say, okay, I can use that. I know what they're for, right? Kind of thing. Because from that point, you can, like, if you go to a business and they say, well, I'm not using that relational database, I'm using this one, you're just like, okay, give me the book, fine, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you're going to need data, okay? Master networking more than ever. Here's a weird thing. We built these massive public clouds, right? And right now, almost all of the chips that are being produced are going to these little teeny devices. I've got devices like here. I've got, there's this thing here, and there's this thing has probably got a device in it, and, like all these devices. That's where the compute is happening now. But the public cloud environment and the business's bases on public cloud, which is essentially a giant, massive database center, okay, have this weird idea that those things are completely different. They're called IoT, or they're called edge, or they're called devices, or they're called something, whatever. And the truth is that networking binds them all together. So learn networking from the ground up, including TCP and IP.
So that's the spiciest take you've said today, Ralph.
You think?
Yeah, because think about it like this, right? I'm getting started, like I'm in college, and I've been building like front-end apps with React. Right?
Okay.
That's my job. That's that's what I was told that if I learn React and I'm really good at React and TypeScript, that I can get a job in tech. And now you're telling me that I need to learn the TCP stack.
Sure. I'll immediately backpedal and say, okay, wait, if you're a web developer, right, do the same thing you're doing, but do it with the web development technologies. However, you have to keep in mind, if you want to expand yourself through your lifetime, okay, remember that in 10 years, I'll say it a different way. Okay, I am in my late 50s. I won't say how old because, but I'm old. And that means that I have seen people in my company and my industry rewrite the wheel to make it better every 5 years, if not only 10. And that means your precious front end, you're a web developer, will be completely destroyed in 5 years. It'll be trash. Why? Some new idea, some new language, some new thing. If you think the browsers are forever, you are living in a fantasy world, not because there won't be browsers, but because there'll be a better thing that is browserish. We don't know what it is yet because that's innovation. You don't get it yet. If it's on the server, like these things, even with front end, I would say, listen, dive into your front end. But what is React? It's JavaScript. Okay, learn a JavaScript engine like Deep while you're in your spare time. Guess what? They're built in C or C++, which means you actually have to learn how JavaScript does the fancy things it does. Okay, fine, learn JavaScript, but you're in a browser, you got to learn CSS. Guess what? That's actually hard, and it's amazing stuff, right? Okay, could you do browser work and take that programming and make it work somewhere not in a browser? Or do you have this weird like narrative box fetish that a browser is the only thing that can ever be programmed? Well, I guarantee you that most chips built today and shipped and embedded and placed in compute environments are not browser capable. And yet they are compute capable. And so my point is not that you don't spend a career doing front end. Maybe you will. It'll be a good thing. But if you don't press the edges of your little, portrait, I'm poking at the video window here that Isaac and I are sharing.
Sure.
If you don't press this edge out and reach for what's off the screen, then you don't grow. And growth is really how you create a career.
I love that. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been doing the show for 5 years, and one of the things that I've found consistently correct over time is that technologists are curious by nature. And I think you can only be in this field for so long if you're not curious to some extent, right? You might want to stick into your area, your little niche space, but like you want to be curious. Like you want to you want to.
I don't even want to. Go ahead. I don't even want to say to somebody, listen, you might have a 15-year career that's fantastic, not being curious, going to work 9 to 5. If that's what you want and you got it, go, baby, go. Don't fight yourself. But if you want to grow and be longer than that, have richer experiences than just that little thing. Because remember, our life is also not our work, depending on how you live your life. It can be together or it can be separate. And if you're going to spend most of your time and your life energy workforce on your life, then keep your work targeted, limited. If you've got a great spot, keep on going. Don't get me wrong. But to take your point, being curious is useful in life, but it's also useful in professional work.
Yeah.
And that point of curiosity and the desire to find out more, the desire to see if you could make this work kind of thing is one of the most beautiful attributes of great engineering. I have to agree.
I agree too. And this conversation has been amazing. I really appreciate your time. I know that it's getting late over there, and I know that you probably
9:08 here in Italy, and I'm bitter. I'm bitter.
Well, I mean, I can't imagine that you getting to drink wine on a call talking about open source is that miserable. So hopefully it was okay for you.
It was fun. It was a real pleasure.
So, and for folks that, might not be following Ralph, I highly recommend it. There's a great mix of just takes on life in general, which I always really appreciate, not just tech stuff. And the easiest way is probably on Blue Sky. So you can find them at Squillace.
Yeah, mostly Blue Sky. I'm also Squillace on Mastodon, on the Hackaderm, that's it. Hackaderm.io. I'm Squillace there as well.
Yeah, and there'll be some links to some different places that you can find him. And I highly recommend you following. So before we sign off, my friend, is there anything that you'd like to say?
Like to say?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Well, so...
We have plenty of time. Don't worry about it.
We're going to edit this down to 5 seconds. No. I'll say the only thing is I'm expecting most people will listen to this because they're interested in something I'm doing or something you're doing, or they're just effing bored or something, whatever it might be. But if you are interested in open source and so forth, the one thing that if somebody's younger and they're trying to figure out how to get ahead and so forth, the one thing I want to make clear is that even with the hard years of economic turmoil we have potentially in front of us, let's imagine that happens. the worst case happens. We have really hard economic times around the world. Remember that, like when I grew up, you had to pay for everything you used in software. And I want everybody to remember their good fortune now, that almost every tool you need to learn and to make Silicon do something it hasn't done before is free. If you can go find it and use it and learn it. And if you do that, there are other people in that environment that you can find them, no matter where, right? On any social app, when in a repo, whatever it is. If you ask a question, how does this work? They will tell you and teach you. And that is the miracle of the epoch we're currently living through. It may not be permanent. I certainly hope it is, because I believe in it. Yeah. But remember your good fortune and take advantage of it.
That's a great way to end things. Take advantage of it. Your good fortune.
Yep.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody that was tuning in live. And, for the folks that are listening in the future, this has been a great show. I hope you listened to the whole thing. And so for my friend Ralph, this has been Coffee and Open Source. And my name is Isaac Levin. And if you're liking these sort of shows, like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.